Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. It really helps this channel bring you more eye-opening stories from behind prison walls. Now imagine this. You're served a tray with a pale, rubbery patty labeled chicken, but it tastes like salty cardboard. Across the street in a fast food joint, someone is biting into a juicy burger with lettuce, tomato, and cheese. Same America. 2 meals. But one is in a prison cafeteria, and what happens inside those kitchens will shock you. Officially, the United States Bureau of Prisons claims that inmates are guaranteed around 2,900 calories per day. These meals, at least on the written menus, are meant to provide a balance of protein, carbohydrates, fruits, vegetables, and dairy. A 2020 Vice News investigation compared these menus to those in a typical high school cafeteria, noting that on paper the difference wasn't dramatic. But that was only the paper version. The reality, what actually lands on an inmate's tray, tells a very different story. Inside federal facilities, chicken patties described as USDA surplus were distributed. They were technically made from chicken, but so processed that they looked and tasted like something far removed from any fresh bird. Former inmates said the texture was closer to wet sponge than meat. When Vice News nutritionists ran a comparison, the prison patty contained half the protein of a fast food burger but nearly double the sodium. This gap isn't accidental. It is the product of a system built on cost-cutting. Since the 1990s, more and more correctional systems have outsourced food services to private companies like Aramark and Trinity Services Group. These corporations bid for contracts worth tens or even hundreds of millions, promising to feed entire state prison populations at rock-bottom prices. The logic is simple: the cheaper the meal, the bigger the profit. In practice, that has meant cutting corners. Reports from Florida and Kentucky showed how meals of baked chicken or stew were replaced with cold bologna sandwiches and watered-down beans. Fresh produce became rare, and substitutions were common. In Michigan, lawsuits revealed that Aramark was caught serving food labeled as expired or even spoiled. One whistleblower described how inmates were served potatoes that had turned green with rot, while another recalled maggots discovered in kitchen areas. The New York Times, interviewing formerly incarcerated people, noted one theme again and again: cravings. It wasn't for steak or ice cream. It was for the basics: fresh fruit, a glass of milk, a piece of cheese. Things that Americans on the outside consider normal, but behind prison walls, became luxuries almost never seen. The consequences go far beyond taste. Nutritionists have warned that prison meals, high in starch and sodium but low in protein and vitamins, contribute to obesity, hypertension, and diabetes among inmates. Others argue that hunger itself becomes a tool of control. When portions shrink, something documented across multiple states, inmates are left feeling unsatisfied. This hunger fuels anger, trade, and even violence inside prison yards. Commissary food, like ramen noodles or peanut butter, becomes currency, while the official cafeteria food loses both trust and value. In one striking contrast, a Vice journalist ordered a standard cafeteria lunch outside: chicken sandwich, fries, a piece of fruit, and milk. Then they placed it side by side with a photographed federal prison meal. The difference was glaring. While the outside lunch looked colorful and balanced, the prison tray was beige, limp, and portions so small that one nutritionist commented, "You'd still be hungry after finishing this." It raises a question that goes to the heart of this story. If prisons are supposed to provide meals equivalent to national nutrition standards, how do we end up with trays that don't even resemble the menus? The answer lies in contracts, loopholes, and a system where food is reduced to numbers on a balance sheet rather than fuel for human survival. Sources: Vice News 2020, New York Times 2017, Michigan court filings, Aramark lawsuits. Florida/Kentucky local reporting. When state prison systems began to expand in the late 20th century, one reality quickly became clear. Feeding tens of thousands of people every single day was enormously expensive. Traditionally, correctional departments had their own in-house kitchens staffed by state employees, but budgets were tight. Politicians demanded tough-on-crime policies while simultaneously slashing costs. It was in this environment that private food service companies like Aramark and Trinity Services Group emerged as solutions. Aramark, a Philadelphia-based giant already managing food for hospitals, schools, and stadiums, began aggressively bidding for prison contracts. By the 2000s, they were feeding inmates in states from Michigan to Florida. Trinity Services Group, a smaller competitor, followed a similar path, often winning bids in southern states. Together, these corporations promised taxpayers millions in savings. But what those savings meant on the ground was very different. In Michigan, Aramark signed a contract in 2013 worth $145 million to feed the state's inmates. Within a year, reports began to surface. Food shortages became common, with meals running out before all inmates had been served. Substitutions were rampant: fresh chicken replaced with soy-based patties, fruit swapped for sugar-filled desserts. Whistleblowers alleged that spoiled food, sometimes visibly moldy, was reheated and served. The scandal deepened when state inspectors discovered maggots in prison kitchens in 2014. Though Aramark insisted the insects never made it onto trays, the optics were disastrous. The Detroit Free Press later revealed that dozens of Aramark employees were caught smuggling contraband into facilities, while others were fired for inappropriate relationships with inmates. By 2015, the state terminated the contract, but not before thousands of incarcerated people had lived through 2 years of meager, sometimes unsafe meals. Florida and Kentucky saw similar complaints under both Aramark and Trinity. In Florida, inmates described meals so insubstantial that men would leave the chow hall still hungry. Lawsuits alleged that private vendors routinely underportioned meals, sometimes by as much as a third of what menus promised. In Kentucky, a 2016 report documented how fruits and vegetables had virtually disappeared from standard meals, replaced by starches like rice and bread. For the companies, the math was simple. Contracts often reimbursed them a fixed amount per prisoner per day, sometimes as little as $2 or $3. That had to cover everything: food, preparation, staff salaries, and overhead. To maintain profit, costs had to be cut at every level. Instead of fresh produce, prisons received canned or powdered substitutes. Instead of whole cuts of meat, they received restructured patties bulked up with fillers. But behind the financial logic is a deeper question of ethics. Prisoners, regardless of their crimes, are wards of the state. The government has a constitutional obligation under the 8th Amendment, protection against cruel and unusual punishment, to provide adequate food. Federal courts have repeatedly ruled that failure to feed prisoners properly can constitute a violation of their rights. Yet lawsuits across multiple states show a pattern: meals falling below nutritional standards, often hidden behind layers of contracts and corporate secrecy. Former inmates interviewed by the New York Times and Vice said the effects weren't just physical. Being fed food they perceived as unsafe or insulting wore down their sense of dignity. It wasn't just that it was small portions, one man recalled. It was that they treated us like we didn't matter enough to even have real food. That does something to you after years. And while Americans outside may complain about the quality of cafeteria lunches, the comparison is stark. A public high school lunch must legally meet USDA standards, include fruits and vegetables, and be balanced for calories and nutrition. In contrast, a prison meal under Aramark or Trinity often fell below those thresholds, yet prisoners had no choice but to accept it. What makes the situation more complex is that prisons are closed systems. Complaints about food rarely leave the walls unless lawsuits, whistleblowers, or investigative journalists bring them to light. For every maggot scandal that hits headlines, countless smaller stories of watery beans, stale bread, or gray meat go unheard. The business of hunger is in many ways invisible. It looks efficient on spreadsheets, but in the daily lives of incarcerated people, it translates into skipped calories, missing nutrition, and meals that blur the line between food and punishment. Sources: Vice News 2020, Detroit Free Press 2014-2015, New York Times 2017, Florida/Kentucky Reporting, Michigan Department of Corrections Court Filings. When you hear the phrase 3 meals a day, it carries an assumption of sufficiency. In theory, prisons meet this obligation. In practice, the quality and content of those meals leave a trail of health problems that follow inmates long after their sentences. Nutritionists who have studied prison diets note a recurring pattern: too much starch, too much sodium, and too little protein or fresh produce. Staple meals might include white bread, overcooked pasta, or potatoes paired with heavily processed patties. Over time, these diets contribute to chronic health conditions. In Michigan, after the Aramark scandal, a state commission review revealed widespread concerns of malnutrition. Inmates reported rapid weight loss, while others gained weight from eating starch-heavy diets with little nutritional balance. Medical staff began to see rising cases of hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. But the effects weren't only physical. Hunger became a daily psychological stressor. Studies cited by the American Journal of Public Health show that inadequate food in correctional settings intensifies anxiety and aggression. When meals don't satisfy basic hunger, inmates are more likely to lash out, at each other or at staff. Inside the prison yard, food isn't just sustenance. It's currency. A pack of ramen noodles from the commissary can be traded for services, favors, or protection. Because official meals are often insufficient, commissary items become survival tools. But not every inmate has money deposited in their account. Those without resources become vulnerable, either falling into debt with stronger inmates or being forced into exploitative arrangements. This underground economy often spirals into violence. Formerly incarcerated people interviewed by the Marshall Project and Human Rights Watch described fights breaking out over something as small as a honey bun or a pack of chips. Commissary debts created hierarchies of control, where gangs dictated who ate well and who starved. The irony is stark. The state saves money by contracting cheap food services, but the ripple effect leads to instability that costs much more in security, medical treatment, and human suffering. Guards have reported that hunger contributes to riots and disturbances. In one case in Georgia, 2012, a statewide prison protest highlighted food quality as a key grievance, alongside medical neglect and overcrowding. Beyond violence, the deprivation of real food has long-term psychological effects. Former inmates frequently say that one of the hardest things about release is walking into a grocery store. After years of being denied fresh fruit or dairy, the sight of abundance can feel overwhelming. One man told the New York Times, "The first time I bit into an apple after prison, I cried. You don't realize how much you miss it until it's gone for years." Even within prison walls, the longing for real food becomes a form of psychological torment. Researchers like Dr. Craig Haney, who has testified in multiple prison condition cases, note that food deprivation undermines dignity and identity. Being fed slop or something perceived as trash food communicates to prisoners that they are worth less than the people outside. This erosion of dignity, paired with confinement, creates conditions where depression, anger, and hopelessness thrive. At its core, food is one of the simplest forms of care a state can provide. Yet in prisons across America, it has been turned into a weapon of control. Some administrators see underfeeding as a way to reduce trouble, keeping inmates lethargic and compliant. Others see it as cost management. Either way, the people inside are the ones who bear the cost, not just in the present moment of eating watery beans, but in the scars carried into the rest of their lives. When compared side by side with real-world food, whether it's a fast food burger, a school cafeteria tray, or a home-cooked dinner, the disparity becomes not only shocking but revealing. It reflects how society chooses to treat those it locks away, not only with walls and bars but with food stripped of nutrition, taste, and even dignity. Sources: American Journal of Public Health 2017, The Marshall Project 2015, Human Rights Watch 2012, New York Times 2017, Georgia Prison Protest Reporting 2012, Testimony of Dr. Craig Haney in U.S. prison litigation cases. For most Americans, complaining about bad food might mean writing a Yelp review. In prison, the only recourse is often the courts. Over the past 3 decades, lawsuits have become the battleground where inmates fight for something as basic as an edible meal. The U.S. Constitution's 8th Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, has been the legal anchor for these battles. Courts have ruled that inadequate food, whether spoiled, nutritionally deficient, or served in portions too small to sustain health, can cross the line into constitutional violation. But proving such claims is difficult, and cases often take years. One of the most high-profile modern examples came from Michigan during Aramark's contract scandal. Inmates filed multiple lawsuits alleging that they were consistently underfed, served spoiled food, and denied basic nutrition. In some cases, prisoners claimed to have lost 20 to 30 pounds in a matter of months. Testimony described finding hair and insects in food, as well as being served meat labeled, "not for human consumption." The Detroit Free Press reported that corrections officers themselves often refused to eat from the kitchens they supervised. These lawsuits forced Michigan's Department of Corrections into damage control. By 2015, the state terminated its $145 million contract with Aramark and later awarded a new contract to Trinity Services Group. Yet problems persisted. Within a year, reports of moldy bread and rotting produce surfaced again, proving that simply switching vendors didn't resolve the underlying issues of cost-driven food service. Elsewhere, similar cases unfolded. In Florida, lawsuits highlighted how portions were systematically reduced. Men incarcerated there alleged that meals often left them in a constant state of hunger. In Kentucky, litigation described how menus promised fruit and vegetables, but trays delivered almost none. Instead, inmates received starch-heavy meals that led to weight fluctuations and health complications. Federal courts have sometimes sided with the inmates. In Porter v. Clark, 2017, while not strictly about food, the Fourth Circuit emphasized that prolonged deprivation of basic human needs, food included, could constitute cruel and unusual punishment. In another case from Illinois, 2010s, prisoners successfully argued that being served rotten meat violated their rights. Settlements often required states to improve oversight and meet USDA nutritional standards. But the reality of reform is uneven. Lawsuits may lead to temporary improvements, but oversight fades once public scrutiny moves on. In many states, prison food is still managed behind closed doors with little transparency. Journalists and watchdog groups often describe hitting walls when requesting menus, contracts, or inspection reports. What these legal battles do reveal, however, is the fragility of the system. Prisons walk a fine line between constitutional obligation and cost-saving pressure. Every time a meal is served that fails to meet nutritional standards, the state exposes itself to legal liability. Yet for decades, contractors and departments have gambled that most inmates lack the resources or support to bring their cases to court. The lawsuits also highlight another truth, that prison food issues aren't isolated to a few bad apples. They are systemic. From Michigan to Florida, Kentucky to Illinois, the patterns repeat. Small portions, spoiled substitutions, and dignity stripped away on a plastic tray. And the consequences extend beyond individual prisons. Every person who leaves incarceration after years of poor nutrition re-enters society with higher medical risks. Taxpayers ultimately bear those costs, whether in Medicaid, hospital visits, or public health burdens. In this sense, prison food lawsuits aren't just about protecting prisoners. They are about protecting society from the ripple effects of neglect hidden inside correctional walls. Sources: Detroit Free Press 2014-2017, Michigan Department of Corrections filings, Florida/Kentucky litigation records, Porter v. Clark, 4th Circle 2017, Illinois Federal Court rulings 2010s, Human Rights Watch reports. For years, meals behind bars are not just monotonous, they are reminders of control. Every tray served says the same thing. You eat what we give you when we give it. No choice. No variety. No dignity. That is why, for many who leave prison, the first meal outside becomes more than food. It becomes a symbol. Formerly incarcerated people interviewed by the New York Times and other outlets consistently describe that first bite as unforgettable. Some talk about craving a steak, a cheeseburger, or fried chicken. Others say it was something far simpler, an apple, a glass of cold milk, or a salad. After years without fresh produce, the crunch of lettuce or the sweetness of fruit can bring overwhelming emotion. One man, released after 15 years in a Florida prison, recalled walking into a diner and ordering eggs, bacon, and toast. Halfway through the meal he broke down crying. It wasn't the taste, he said. It was the feeling that I was finally treated like a person again. These moments reveal how prison food isn't just about calories. It's about humanity. When food is stripped of flavor, freshness, and choice, it sends a message: you are less than. You don't deserve what others take for granted. For those on the outside, the difference between a prison tray and a cafeteria lunch might look small. But to the person eating it every day for years, that difference grows into something far larger, a marker of worth. Sociologists argue that this is where prison food becomes more than nutrition. It becomes a tool of punishment and control. By reducing meals to the bare minimum, often tasteless, sometimes unsafe, institutions reinforce the idea that incarceration is not only about losing freedom, but about losing the small comforts that make life human. And yet, when those same individuals return to society, the effects linger. Decades of processed, low-nutrient food leave many with health issues: high blood pressure, diabetes, weakened immune systems. Public health experts warn that this cycle of deprivation followed by re-entry burdens not only the individuals but the communities they return to. Medical bills rise, diets struggle to adjust, and trauma around food can take years to heal. The most haunting part of these stories is not just what is missing from prison trays, fruit, dairy, fresh vegetables, but what that absence represents. It is a daily reminder that punishment in America often extends far beyond the sentence handed down in court. It extends to every bite of watery beans, every processed patty, every piece of stale bread. When Vice News placed a prison meal beside a fast food burger in 2020, the visuals spoke louder than words. On one plate, a colorful sandwich with fresh toppings and a side of fries. On the other, a beige rectangle of meat-like substance and a spoonful of mush. The message was clear: in the same country, two standards of food exist. One for the free and one for the confined. The question is whether this difference reflects justice or cruelty. America promises rehabilitation but feeds punishment. It promises equal dignity under law, but delivers meals that strip dignity away. For the men and women who step out of prison gates, the first bite of real food is not just nourishment. It is reclamation. It is proof that they are no longer a number on a contract, no longer an entry on a balance sheet, no longer a body to be cheaply fed. For a brief moment, with a fork in hand and a plate of real food before them, they feel human again. Sources: New York Times 2017, Vice News 2020, Human Rights Watch reports, interviews with formerly incarcerated individuals. If the prison cafeteria represents control, the commissary represents survival. In theory, the commissary is a small store where inmates can purchase extras, snacks, toiletries, sometimes even clothing, using money deposited in their accounts by family or earned through prison jobs. But in practice, the commissary has become something much more: a parallel food system that fills the gaps left by the official meals. In many facilities, commissary shelves are lined with ramen noodles, instant coffee, chips, cookies, and canned meat like tuna or mackerel. None of these items were designed to replace balanced meals, but they do what the chow hall often fails to do: provide enough calories and in some cases more palatable flavors. The economics are stark. A 2018 Prison Policy Initiative report estimated that the average incarcerated person spends hundreds of dollars a year on commissary, despite earning wages as low as 14 to 63 cents per hour. Families on the outside often bear this cost, sending money to ensure their loved ones don't go hungry. For poor families, it can mean sacrificing bills or groceries just so someone inside can buy a pack of noodles. Commissary food also becomes currency. In a closed economy where cash is banned, items like ramen packets, honey buns, or bags of chips serve as money. Inmates trade them for services, gamble with them, or use them to repay debts. The value fluctuates depending on supply and demand. In some prisons, a pack of ramen is more stable than a US dollar. But this underground economy has darker sides. Commissary goods can fuel extortion, with stronger inmates forcing weaker ones to hand over their food in exchange for safety. Debts spiral into violence, sometimes over something as trivial as a snack cake. Guards report fights erupting not just in the chow hall but in cells, sparked by who owes whom a bag of chips or a jar of peanut butter. The nutritional consequences are equally troubling. Commissary food is calorie-dense but rarely nutritious. Dietitians note that ramen noodles and processed snacks are packed with sodium, preservatives, and fats. Inmates who rely heavily on commissary may gain weight rapidly, developing health conditions like hypertension or worsening diabetes. Yet for many, the choice is between tasteless, insufficient meals in the chow hall or overprocessed junk food from the commissary. One telling detail: former inmates often describe their most memorable prison recipes. These improvised dishes, sometimes called spreads, are created by combining commissary items into something resembling a real meal. Ramen noodles mixed with crushed chips, canned mackerel, and a squeeze of ketchup might become a makeshift casserole. Cookies crushed into milk powder become desserts. For some, these spreads are not just meals but cultural markers of prison life, carrying meaning long after release. The commissary also highlights inequality behind bars. Those with outside financial support can eat better, trading commissary items for protection or comfort. Those without money remain dependent on the chow hall, often going hungry or falling into dangerous debts. This disparity deepens the divide between inmates and fuels resentment. Ultimately, commissary is both lifeline and trap. It keeps people fed when the chow hall fails, but it also reinforces cycles of debt, violence, and poor health. It reveals the uncomfortable truth. In American prisons, survival often depends not on what the state provides, but on what you or your family can afford to buy. Sources: Prison Policy Initiative 2018, Marshall Project 2015, New York Times interviews with former inmates, Human Rights Watch reports. To understand today's prison meals, processed patties, watery beans, and budget-driven substitutions, we need to look back at how prison food has evolved across American history. In the 19th century, punishment was often physical, and food reflected that philosophy. Inmates could be sentenced to a bread and water diet 4 days at a time, a practice designed not to sustain but to punish. Reports from early penitentiaries in Pennsylvania and New York describe meals so monotonous and sparse that malnutrition was common. At times, food itself was wielded as a disciplinary tool, with prisoners placed on reduced rations for breaking rules. By the early 20th century, reforms began to push prisons toward providing at least minimally balanced meals. Progressive reformers argued that nutrition was part of rehabilitation. Menus included beans, stews, bread, and occasionally meat or milk. Still, the quality varied widely depending on funding and oversight. Prisons in wealthier northern states often provided more consistent meals, while facilities in the South, many linked to labor camps, offered food barely above subsistence. The Great Depression and World War II introduced new pressures. With food rationing across the country, prisons cut costs wherever possible, often relying on surplus commodities. Inmates in this era frequently reported meals dominated by potatoes, cornmeal, and lard, with meat appearing only occasionally. The emphasis was on bulk calories rather than nutrition. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s, amid a wave of civil rights lawsuits, that prison food began to face serious legal scrutiny. Courts increasingly ruled that inadequate food could violate the Constitution. A landmark case, Holt v. Sarver, 1970, in Arkansas, declared that the state's prison conditions, including food quality, amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. This set a precedent that inmates could challenge not just physical abuse, but systemic neglect through the courts. The 1980s and 90s brought a different shift: privatization. As prison populations exploded under the war on drugs and tough-on-crime policies, state budgets strained to keep up. Companies like Aramark and Trinity Services Group stepped in, offering to handle food service contracts at lower costs than state-run kitchens. On paper, it was efficiency. In practice, it became a system where cutting costs often meant cutting corners. By the 2000s, prison food in America had become a business. Contracts worth hundreds of millions dictated what millions of incarcerated people ate. Private contractors competed to promise the lowest per-inmate costs, sometimes as little as $2 a day. Menus were standardized across facilities, with processed meats, powdered eggs, and canned vegetables replacing fresh ingredients. The scandals of the 2010s, maggots in Michigan kitchens, spoiled meat in Florida, starvation lawsuits in Kentucky, were not anomalies. They were the predictable result of a century-long trend, treating food as a tool of control and a line item on a balance sheet rather than a human right. Today, prison food exists in a paradox. Legally, inmates must be fed enough to survive, but culturally, society accepts that those meals can be stripped of dignity, nutrition, and taste. The history shows us that this isn't new. What has changed are the forms, from bread and water punishment to corporate contracts. Yet the underlying philosophy remains: food in prison is not primarily about nourishment. It is about control. Sources: Holt v. Sarver, 1970, Historical Reports from Pennsylvania and New York Penitentiaries, Prison Policy Initiative, Detroit Free Press 2014-2017, Vice News 2020. When Vice News placed a prison patty beside a fast food burger, the difference seemed absurd. But that image is more than a comparison of meals. It is a reflection of values. Prison food is not just about calories. It is about dignity, humanity, and the line between punishment and cruelty. For decades, America has allowed cost-cutting and control to dictate what millions of incarcerated people eat. The result is a system where spoiled meat, watery beans, and starch-heavy diets are normalized, even defended as efficient. But food is memory. It is culture. It is survival. When inmates leave prison and cry over their first apple or their first cold glass of milk, they remind us of something profound. Deprivation is not rehabilitation. Hunger does not heal. Stripping away dignity through food does not create safer communities. The real difference between prison food and real food is not just taste. It is the difference between being treated as human and being reduced to a number. Until that gap is closed, prison meals will continue to tell a story, not of justice but of neglect hidden on a tray.